tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We're going to be talking with Gleb Lisikh of the C2C Journal in just a few moments' time here. But I just want to talk about this in the context here, because he put forward a great essay in C2C Journal, in which he talked about a simple meat and potato recipe for making a pandemic. And he talks about this in basically two main pieces of detail. One is the reliance on PCR tests. You remember PCR tests? They were all the rage through 2020 and 2021 and kind of into 2022 as well. You used to have to do one if you wanted to get back into your own country. And also the over-reporting of COVID death numbers. Both of these things were crucial pieces of evidence that the government relied on in explaining just how dangerous and dire things were. And these things ultimately became the cornerstones of the pandemic narrative that really carried much of the last 3 years. So it's a very thoughtful piece. And as I've said on the show, it's a bit challenging sometimes when we had to live through this to want to stay in this terrain for so long. But I also believe there is, generally speaking, a sense of justice that people need. A lot of folks are not prepared just to live and let live and offer that so-called pandemic amnesty. I saw a video from some ostensibly right-of-center commentator today giving an apology for comments he made about unvaccinated people, for example, earlier in the pandemic. And I watched this apology video, and but it offered no sense of why it was wrong and no sense of why he believed what he believed and what changed. Now, I'm a big believer that if someone is going to go through an evolution in how they think and how they approach an issue, we should encourage it and we should welcome it, but you've got to show your work and you've got to explain what it is that has actually changed, as opposed to just demanding forgiveness because you realize that whatever view you had a year ago or 5 minutes ago is no longer in vogue with the audience that you have now. And I think that's the key thing here whenever anyone's talking about the idea of pandemic amnesty. So we'll talk about this in the context of this essay here with Gleb Lisikh, who's a C2C contributor and also a researcher and IT professional. Gleb, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today. So, I mean, you've actually distilled a very complex concept into fairly simple terms here, but am I understanding your point correctly that you feel the two sort of big data issues that we saw here came down to the PCR tests and the related but also distinct phenomenon of the death counts?
Yeah, that's pretty much was the idea, right? The COVID waters were very, very murky, and there are all kinds of things that come into equation. The government response, the officials, the media, hospitalizations, the hospital bed utilization, and stuff like that. So many things. So to me, it was important to distill this to those key concepts that pretty much drove everything else, right? So we had cases and we had deaths. Cases would estimate the scale of that, let's call it a disaster, right? And the deaths would estimate the severity. Everything else was kind of in between or supported by all those numbers. So that's why I wanted to take all those side components out of the equation and just plug the major numbers in and present them in a way that not only highlight the aspects of this COVID pandemic, but would also apply to any pandemic going forward, because ultimately, if we're going to have another one, it will be gauged by the same numbers, cases and deaths. That's it.
Yeah, and I think both are challenging. I mean, originally cases were the thing that everyone cared about because, cases were the way you'd measure how widespread something was in a community. And at a certain point, when I forget which wave it was, I don't know if it was Omicron or something, when
Yeah.
we saw cases just completely swell, but deaths continued to be in decline. And, the idea of at that time taking anything meaningful of cases, when people, myself included, were testing positive despite having zero symptoms of anything. So, I mean, that is not a meaningful positive result. And whether it's that it's a false positive or your case is so mild that you don't even know you have it, to me, is not necessarily relevant there. But people were still trying to make policy on that and saying, well, the high cases mean we need to keep mask mandates in place. We need to keep X, Y, and Z in place.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think it was around January 2022 when Omicron was at its best, and the cases were through the roof. And people started wondering, like, why are we really counting those, right? And how are we counting that? And is it the effort and counting that brings up the cases up, or is it actually the cases themselves or the disease? So it was becoming very apparent and laughable that counting cases, the techniques of counting cases, the demand for cases or forcing everybody to test was what was driving the case numbers. As soon as they stopped counting, cases disappeared.
Is your view on the PCR test that it was being used for something that it was never intended to be used for, and that the issues that you've identified were more accidental? Or was your view that this was being deliberately used because it would give this number that would then support all of these policies the government wanted to put in? I guess the question is, was this something that was a byproduct of a bad policy, or was this a policy that was designed, in your view, to be more manipulative?
In my personal opinion, and again, I'm not claiming to be the final instance of everything, so anybody can read the article and make up their own mind. I'm not trying to draw any conclusions, but since you're asking me personally, I think it was a deliberate
Hmm.
attempt. There's absolutely no way for me how um, a medical, a scientist or expert in PCR testing, for example, or the testing of any sort, would legitimately authorize PCR to be a clinical diagnostics tool. Judging from that, it was totally inappropriate to use it as a clinical diagnostics tool. You can use PCR, and the PCR is a great technology, right? That allows you to, let's say, estimate the presence of certain pathogen within a population because it's totally probabilistic. So you can apply it to masses and come up with a probabilistic estimate of how much of that particular pathogen, virus, or whatever is present within a certain group of population. But when it comes to clinical diagnostic, deciding whether a particular person is sick, it has a disease, it totally fails to do its job because it's a probabilistic tool. It's never been designed for clinical diagnostics. The very inventor of this technology questioned that, not specifically for COVID, but for viruses in general,
Hmm.
right? So to me, it's absolutely impossible how a medically knowledgeable person can make a decision to use PCR for clinical diagnostics, which inevitably follows that it was a deliberate attempt to exaggerate cases through misuse of the PCR.
And I said at the beginning, when we look at cases and deaths, that the two are different, but they're very related because
Yeah.
the PCR testing, and for example, you couldn't go to a hospital with a broken leg without getting a COVID test, meant that all of a sudden people that never would have been tested on their own were getting logged as COVID hospitalizations. And if something happened where you died, we know that there was this issue of people dying with COVID versus of COVID, which messed with the numbers. And I mean, you had some stories in the US where someone, went in with a motorcycle accident that killed them and they were logged as a COVID death because they happen to have COVID or something like that. And you had governments say, oh, we're trying to do our best to filter these cases out. But the two really are interconnected in the sense that someone gets a PCR test, someone is a COVID case, someone dies of something, all of a sudden the natural instinct is to log them as a COVID death, regardless of what killed them.
Yeah, and I can even share my personal story, and I'm sure many people would probably know someone with whom something similar happened. So my wife's aunt in Moscow, Russia, right? I'm not talking about Canada anymore. I just because it's been pretty much all over the world in Moscow. So my wife's aunt, she was very unhealthy individual with tons of various diseases. She had difficulties moving around the home, and pretty much she needed help from someone else. Like she could not be by herself. So finally, she got to the point where she had to be brought into the hospital in 2020. For something completely different, not COVID at all, right? She had enough other problems to be worried about. So after about a week or two, I don't remember exactly, but she was finally diagnosed with COVID. Basically, the test came up positive, from which point she got moved from this ward, whatever she was in, into the COVID ward, and she died there. And I end of the story. Right.
Wow.
I have other personal stories to share, but this is just an example of what was happening in hospitals. People were tested basically daily in 2020, 2021 for COVID because of the PCR test nature. Obviously, sooner or later it would give you a positive result, which triggers moving the person to a different ward where they would be treated from COVID or get no treatment at all as in initial stages of disease. That was the advice. Don't do anything, pretty much, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to being treated from what they suffered from. So it was completely mistreatment of the people that got them killed in those COVID wards. I'm not talking about COVID treatment. I don't want to go in that area yet, but that's pretty much the very, very common scenario. You get moved to the COVID ward, you're mistreated and you die. And the death certificate says you died from COVID. Well, because the PCR test was positive.
Well, sir, I mean, it's certainly a simple and logical concept you've put forward here, Gleb. Cases plus deaths equals the story of the pandemic. But if each of those premises is fraught with its own data challenges, then we are seeing exactly what you've described here and what you go into more detail in your essay in C2C Journal, making a pandemic a simple meat and potato recipe. And again, we've only really scratched the surface here, but I would encourage people to read that for themselves. Gleb Lisikh, thank you so much for coming on. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.